Okay, so this week we're getting into a very squeaky chair and the interwar period. So the war is over, but the world is no longer the same. And this unit's focus is on the tensions that rise, largely brought out by changes caused during the war, and those tensions get resolved across the globe because while we'll see a lot of commonalities in the struggles that different countries deal with after World War One, the way that those countries solve those problems varies pretty drastically. And so this week we're going to focus in on the U.S. and let's get started. The U.S. after the war is, I mean, realistically, the U.S. only fought in the war for a little under a year, and of soldiers actually being over there. And while there were U.S. casualties in the war, and the U.S. definitely invested a lot in the war, it's not going to be the same level of devastation as we'll see with Europe, largely because the U.S.'s land isn't devastated because it wasn't a battlefield. And so there's a lot less rebuilding in the U.S. after the war, unlike what we'll see in Europe. But it takes about a year for soldiers to start to come home from the Western Front, which is a really long time. You think about the fighting stops in 1918, but U.S. soldiers don't start to return home until 1919, in part because it takes a while for the soldiers to be packed onto ships and then sailed home, and in another part just because of the length of the peace conference and kind of the way in which the war was ended. And then once those soldiers come home, they have a really hard time readjusting to everyday life, in part because they've gone through something that transformed them so completely that they don't really know who they are anymore, and they have to discover who they are in this post-war veteran identity. And then in another part because when they come home together and all at once, and that becomes another problem for the economy. And so we're going to see that soldiers struggle to readjust, and this generation of people who came of age, who grew up, who became adults during World War One, they become known as the lost generation, and largely because when they came home, they didn't really know what to make of their lives. You know, their college years or their early business years, rather than them starting their adult life, had been learning a skill of combat, which they definitely don't need in peacetime. And so we see a workforce that has been reshaped by war, and a generation that doesn't really know what their place in it is. So a lot of the artists of this time period express that sense of directionlessness in the art that gets produced, like The Great Gatsby. Bill Gamage, who is the speaker of this quote that we have on screen, talks about how difficult it is for soldiers to readjust to civilian life, and how a lot of them fall into drinking and drugs as a way to kind of avoid the problems, and also violence that becomes what they're used to, and so they actively seek it out. And we see that frustration with alcohol in the U.S. turn into a prohibition as the U.S. votes to make alcohol illegal, and then that creates a whole bunch of illegal rum running where organized crime bosses, kind of like the mafia, end up illegally producing or procuring alcohol, and prohibition ends up being a big failure. But the U.S. Army ends up discharging all 4 million soldiers on the same couple months, and they discharge them with $60 and a ticket home. And after that $60 goes, which, it was a decent amount of money, but it's not like months worth of salary, the soldiers are left with nothing. And so we see 4 million soldiers try to enter the workforce. What impact would 4 million young men suddenly wanting to enter the workforce have on the economy? What kinds of jobs would they be looking for as unskilled laborers? What kinds of people would they be competing against for those jobs? Think about women who had taken up work during the war. What are they going to do now? The men are home. Do they just give up working? And we see movements for women's rights crop up during the 1920s as during the war, women proved to themselves that they are capable of holding jobs and working. And so at the end of the war, they don't necessarily want to just give up their jobs and go back home. So a lot of tension comes from the 1920s. We also have, before we get into the 20s, the influenza pandemic, which we haven't talked about a lot yet. We've mentioned it a couple of times, but in 1918, starting in Fort Riley, Kansas, we see the spread of an H1N1 flu that is so incredibly easy to transmit and deadly that it becomes known as the mother of all pandemics. One of the things that this flu could do was when most people have come in contact with the flu at some point in their lives. Like, you've probably had the flu. And if you've had the flu, your body remembers how to fight the flu. And so even if you come in contact with this year's version of the flu, your body knows how to fight it because it's seen something similar to it before. But what happens in 1918 is the flu changes so much that basically the entirety of the human population has no antigens, no thing within them that knows how to fight this version of the flu. And because of that antigenetic shift, we see this flu spread really aggressively. On top of that, can you think of why the flu would spread so aggressively if it starts in Fort Riley, Kansas, which is a military base in Kansas in 1918? Because as American soldiers get sent to the Western Front, they're stuck on ships for months while they cross the Atlantic, and soldiers infected with the flu spread it throughout the ship. And then when the ship docks, soldiers end up going into the trenches where they meet soldiers from literally around the world, and the flu spreads like wildfire through the trenches. So that final year of fighting in World War I is marked with one of the world's most deadliest flus. Problem is that when the fighting stops, the flu doesn't, and so all those soldiers end up going home and take with them home the flu, and then from there it spreads, because this is one of our first examples of a global pandemic where a disease is able to spread throughout pretty much every corner of the globe because everyone was connected to the war in some way, shape, or form. No one's really free of it. It's estimated that somewhere between 50 to 100 million people died because of the flu, and that is more than all of the World War I casualties combined. If we look just at the deaths, it's somewhere between twice as many people dying in World War I or 4 times as many people dying, depending on whose number is more likely. Which means that as a soldier fighting in the war, you come home and find out that the dying doesn't stop. Somewhere between 20 and 40% of the world's population actually catches the same flu. And of that 20 to 40%, 1 in 5 of them who get the flu are going to die from the flu. That's a really high mortality rate. To kind of put that in perspective, the current mortality rate of the, oh my gosh, I forgot the name of it. Of COVID-19. How could I forget the name of it? The mortality rate of COVID-19 right now is like 4%. And I mean, I'm not to say that that's not a lot, because that is a lot, especially when we consider kind of all of the different actions that our governments across the world have taken to protect us from it, including this current stay-at-home order. That means that, like, the reason we're doing this. And that's for 4%. Meanwhile, 1918, that flu was at 20% mortality, and it really attacked those with a strong immune system, which was unusual for the flu. Flu usually attacks the elderly and the very young, or the already sick, but this flu that would cause an immune system to kind of attack itself, and the stronger your immune system, the stronger the attack. And so we see people between the ages of 20 and 40 really getting sick and dying from this flu, which is, again, not a great thing when the age group that mainly gets hit by this is soldiers in the war. Most governments, because think about it, it's the final year of fighting. Your soldiers are exhausted, they're tired, they're ready to give up, and they don't need to hear that back home their families are fighting with a flu. And so most governments censored news about the flu in order to keep morale up during the war, except for Spain, who hadn't gotten involved in World War I. And because they were removed from the fighting, they were free to report about the pandemic. And so, because Spain is one of the few countries that allows news to spread about the flu, it becomes known as the Spanish flu. Not because people in Spain caught it or cured it, but just because they were the ones who were able to report about it. This image of a face mask was, one of the ways that they spread information about how to protect people during the flu. And we see some social norms change, like spitting no longer becomes common. This piece of propaganda to try to encourage people to stop spitting is pretty wonderful. In class, in the Zoom class, we got into a weird debate over whether it was a goat or a devil, but the evil spit's pretty funny. But you can see that there's a lot of information that's trying to both express the severity of the flu, like coughs and sneezes spread diseases as dangerous as poison gas shells, or like just the general awareness, go home and go to bed until you are well. And we see that schools close down, theaters close down, churches are closed, meetings are closed. But because the war is still going on in the early part of the flu, the jobs still remained open. Like, you had to go to work, you had to go work in your factories so that your soldiers continued to receive the supplies that they needed. And this is a photo of an infirmary, an impromptu one. They took over school gym spaces, theaters, sports arenas, basically any place that they could set up beds, because hospitals and traditional avenues for taking care of the sick were completely overwhelmed by just the sheer number of people who end up getting sick with this flu. So go ahead and take a moment to pause here and think about what it would be like to live in 1918. And in the fall of 1918, the flu makes it a big resurgence, and it goes all the way through the flu season into 1919. So the war is over, but people keep dying, especially, if you had been a soldier who fought in the war, and then you come home and find out that the flu is more effective at killing than all of the things that you'd seen in war. What kind of impact is that going to have on a person's ability to have hope for the future and what they think is possible? And if you can, try to connect your answer back to this idea of the young adults of this time being known as the lost generation. So the flu isn't the only thing creating tension in the early 1920s. We also have economic, political, and social struggles that are going to make things really hard in the U.S. And going to be a lot of lessons that the U.S. has to learn, especially in how to deal with demobilization. So during the war, the U.S. government had gotten really involved in the economy, which was new because the U.S. government largely followed laissez-faire capitalism, this idea that you hands off and you let them do what they're going to do. But during the war effort, in order to make sure that the U.S. produced what it needed to in order to support the Allies, there's a lot of government subsidies and government contracts to pay Americans to produce the things that the government needs for the war effort. And we see under government guidance, U.S. steel manufacturing doubles and agricultural output triples. And that's because farmers are able to take out loans from banks and use those loans to buy new farming equipment like this tractor here that really allowed the same number of farmers to produce so much more food. And the farmers were comfortable taking on the debt of these loans to buy this new farming equipment because they were going to end up being able to sell whatever they grew to the U.S. government, and they didn't have to worry about like if there was going to be a buyer for all the food that they were producing. And so the federal government doesn't end up having a plan for demobilization or like getting out of the war and transitioning from wartime production into peacetime production, which means that when the war ends and the armistice is declared, U.S. government just cancels all of its contracts with all of the producers. They're like, well, I guess we don't need any more of these. Like, we don't need more steel or crops. Just cancel the contracts, which means farmers and companies that had invested in new machinery to produce their goods all of a sudden found that there was no one willing to buy it, which means that we see hundreds of factories that had produced war materials or transitioned over to producing more materials are closed pretty much overnight. And demand for American agriculture drops because during the war, when France and Germany and Britain are unable to farm because they're fighting each other, the US is basically feeding all of Europe. And after the war, the farmers can produce enough food to feed basically all of Europe, but no one in Europe is buying anymore. And the US government isn't buying it and sending it overseas. And so demand for agriculture drops. All of this leads to Americans becoming unemployed. Combine that with the fact that 4 million American soldiers just showed up at home looking for a job. And by 1920, we have more than 5 million Americans looking for work and unable to find it. When the war ends, Americans spend money because that's what we're really good at. And a lot of people during the war had been holding on to money, uncertain about what would happen in the future and wanting to make sure that they had enough savings. But when peace is declared, Americans feel better about the future of the world. And so they end up spending their money. They end up spending so much money that they actually cause prices to rise within the economy, or inflation, where there's so many people trying to buy the products that are available that there's basically not enough supply to meet demand. And so the sellers end up raising prices until they find the buyer who's willing to pay the most. And we see inflation happen in the US, which is a good thing and a bad thing. Inflation, if it happens slowly and gives people time to adjust, is a totally fine thing for a healthy economy. But if it happens too quickly, it can really hurt people who don't make enough money. And in the 1920s, we see that risky type of inflation happening as Americans are paying double what they would have paid for everyday necessities like bread, butter, and, as one report noted, bacon. As prices had doubled for that stuff in 1913. And people can't buy less bread, right? Like, you need a certain amount of bread to feed your family, and so you'll cut spending elsewhere in order to keep buying the same amount of food that you need. And all but the wealthiest Americans are going to see their standard of living drop a little bit because of the rising prices. They'll have to stop spending the money on little extra frivolous things, as that money now needs to go towards buying their basic everyday necessities. Between 1920 and 1921, almost 100,000 businesses end up failing, and 450,000 farmers lose their family farms. And those lands are bought up by the banks, where the farmers own their debts, or consolidated into larger farms owned by wealthy humans who then sharecrop out the work. But across the country, we see a rise in organized crime as people are hard to find work and need to make money, and the government isn't able to provide jobs, and the economy isn't able to provide jobs, and so people turn to crime. This here is a photo of Al Capone, a famous gangster who ran all sorts of organized crime, from alcohol, like bootlegged alcohol, to bribing officials, and thought he was untouchable. In fact, you can see him here in front of police officers. He ran an organized crime family successfully until the IRS caught him for not paying his taxes. During the war, we end up seeing the U.S. government resolve a lot of labor disputes because it's getting involved to keep the factories open. And in order to make sure that workers keep showing up at the factories, the National War Labor Board ends up settling disputes between workers and factory owners, oftentimes favoring the worker, which means that during World War I, we see in the U.S. workers getting paid more, there being more jobs available, and we also see unions gaining influence during the war as those skilled laborers come together and form unions, and are able to then negotiate with the nation war labor board in order to get better wages or better safety conditions or better hours. In fact, the average workday drops down to 8 hours during World War I because of negotiations by unions. And then the war ends and corporations take over the labor negotiations, and they're not interested in like the same things that the US government is, and so negotiations become much stricter, and we see wages end up getting reduced, work days extended. They try to go back to a 12-hour workday. It doesn't quite work out in most places. We also see safety regulations relaxed, which makes factory work more dangerous. And all of this ends up resulting in labor unions trying to negotiate with the factory owners, failing at negotiations as factory owners say, do it because we're not going to pay you anymore. And then the labor unions having to resort to striking. And so we see during the early 1920s a lot of strikes going on as unions come together to form larger unions like the American Federation of Labor to try to protect American workers from what they felt were unfair working conditions set by factory owners. It's interesting to note that the American Federation of Labor, however, is only interested in the unions of skilled laborers. They didn't want to organize with unskilled workers. And that's not to say like talent versus not talent. This is like, did you have to go to on the job? Like, did you have to be trained to be able to do the job? So like technically right here, this is skilled labor because I had to go get a credential in order to be able to do it. But a job where you wouldn't necessarily have to go to school to be able to operate it, like a factory floor working position or working at, we're going to use McDonald's as the example here, is unskilled labor. The AFL wasn't interested in unions that were looking at organizing unskilled laborers or women or African Americans or immigrants because they wanted to protect the labor of what they felt were skilled workers. We also see another big union rise in the US of the industrial workers of the world. And here we see the rise of socialism in a post-World War I America. As, we have the Russian Revolution and communists and everybody who's against the communists fighting in a Russian civil war. In the US, we see the government getting involved in the economy in World War I had actually helped stabilize the economy and convinced a lot of people that socialism was an acceptable path forward. And so the Industrial Workers of the World was a union that worked to solve working class issues by uniting workers together. In their constitution, they talk about how there's no peace available when the workers struggle, but the employing class has a good life. And we see that what we talked about back in Unit 3, that classic struggle between the working class and the owners, and that competing interests, right? The leader of the IWW ends up saying that the goal is to place the working class in command of the machinery of production and distribution without regard to its capitalist masters. We see this urge in the early 20s to control free market capitalism because free market capitalism wasn't benefiting everybody. In 1919 alone, there were over 3,600 strikes. This means that 1 in 10 American workers walked off their job in some sort of union protest. And oftentimes, when workers walked off the job for a strike, strikes would lead to tensions between employers and employees, as well as just straight up violence in the streets as, union workers stand outside of a business on strike, and then that business hires people to break the strike lines to come in and work anyway. And we see violence becomes associated with strikes in a lot of places across the country. And so Americans start to draw a correlation or a connection between strikers and people going on strike and just a general state of chaos and violence and anarchy. So This ends up having a negative consequence for unions, as people associate unions with nothing more than street violence. They don't see unions as being able to protect the worker. And so unions get less support throughout the 20s than they had during the war. And this means that the unions are then less able to negotiate on behalf of the workers, which means that we see wages for workers throughout the 1920s kind of stagnate and hold still. And we see little progress for the majority of Americans throughout the 1920s, even though in the 1920s we're going to see American wealth grow. In April of 1919, we see anarchists take on a new threat. Anarchists is a word to describe people who don't believe in a government. They don't think that people need government. Oftentimes, anarchists will promote cooperation in community, thinking that people don't need a government to tell them what to do or how to live, that human society will just continue on. Anarchists are a hard group to kind of define because they often don't agree with each other. And in the 1920s, we see anarchists argue a lot over what it means to be an anarchist. But in 1919, frustrations with the government and its inability to protect workers or provide jobs or protect the health of people combines with a general frustration with the unfairness of capitalism, and that leads to an anarchist group planting 36 bombs and mailing them to politicians and capitalists across the country. The bombs end up being discovered before they detonate, which is wonderful, but it does build a sense of fear among many Americans about the radicalization of extreme groups. And so we see Americans start to fear what they view as radical changes to the system. And so in this case, radicals are labeled as socialists, communists, or anarchists, as they want to see pretty significant changes to the way the U.S. government and the U.S. economy functions. A fear of radicals, especially communists, because of the Russian Revolution. Lenin in the Russian Revolution is looking for a workers' revolution across the globe. Lenin doesn't want to just see the revolution end in Russia. He wants to see workers rise against their, factory owners across the globe and give speeches and propaganda to that effect. There's a lot of fear that kind of violence and upheaval of a system would spread to the U.S., and that becomes part of the first Red Scare, Red being a nickname for a communist. And so we see propaganda like the staircase over here, showing how labor unions, represented here by that exciting leg, would lead to strikes, which would lead to riots, which would lead to Bolshevism or communism, which would lead to chaos. Because while the Russian Revolution starts in 1917, it doesn't end until 1923. And so during the early 20s, communism is synonymous with just open warfare and civil war. So the bombings don't stop, and in June we see 9 bombs detonated in 8 cities at the same time, which shows a level of organization and planning that really strikes fear in a lot of Americans, that the communists or the anarchists, this happens to be an anarchist group, but they don't know at the time, that the extremists are going to destroy the American way of life. Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, who ends up being one of the targets of the bombings in April, he responds to this wave of threats with a campaign against what he labels as subversives. These are any people who look to overthrow the government or the economy or the current ways of American life, which conveniently for Palmer is a neat list of communists or socialists or anyone who's advocating for radical change. With his help of his assistant, J. Edgar Hoover, they end up conducting raids on homes and businesses and meeting places without any sort of legal authorization to do so, other than what they tell themselves they can. And that results in 6,000 suspected radicals being arrested, and many of them who were foreign born and immigrants getting deported back to war torn Europe without any sort of court hearing or legal representation, which is a huge violation of people's civil liberties, of the rights guaranteed by American law. And so we see the Palmer raids in the early 20s represent just how far a government is willing to go to protect itself from the fear of subversives or radicals. Palmer is a nativist, and he's one of many, as we see a rise in this idea of nativism, that a good America is one that protects the native-born people first. And when I say native-born people, I don't mean like the Chippewa or the Cree or the Lakota. I mean like, white Americans who were born in America and maybe their parents were born in America. We're looking at, descendants of colonists and basically not, Irish Catholics or Italians or anyone from Eastern Europe, but people who had been born in America to Americans. And nativists start to, at this point in time, publicly argue fear of immigrants who will never, in their eyes, be really 100% American. The National Security League, a famous nativist organization, they end up arguing that the immigrant communities will hold on to old world prejudices and they'll never think like a real America. They don't think in terms of America, ignoring the fact that these people left their homes to seek out America and in many ways were actively trying to get away from old world prejudices. Nativist theories looked at people new to the country as somehow not American, even if they obtained citizenship. One of the things that nativists at this time would talk about, how people refer to America as a melting pot of a bunch of different cultures coming together and combining. Nativists in the 1920s argued that the melting pot had not melted. And in fact, there are little pockets of different cultural identities throughout the U.S. of people refusing to become 100% American. Combine this kind of American-born interests first with the fear of radicalism spreading from Eastern Europe and the Russian Revolution, with the fact that people can't find work, and we have a lot of Americans actually getting really aggressive against immigration at this time. By 1924, we see the Immigration Act really restrict the number of Americans allowed into country, that's supposed to be the country, to only 164,000 people, which is relatively small. They also ban all immigrants from Asia, trying to keep America, as it was supposed to be. I don't fully understand the racist theories here. But what's important to note is that by the end of the 1920s, immigration is only a quarter of what it had been at the start of the 1920s, because these policies of not allowing foreigners into our country becomes popular, especially as people start competing against each other for work. There was a fear that immigrants would take American jobs. Even though the data shows that immigrants take the jobs that Americans don't want. But this is not a place for data and logic. This is instead a place for racial and religious bigotry. So by 1915, we see the revival of the KKK with the lynching of a Jewish American factory manager who had been falsely accused of killing a woman. And lynching is the hanging of a person by an angry mob, in this case members of the Ku Klux Klan. The imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, which is someone in their hierarchy, I don't fully understand the hierarchy of the KKK, but they get fun names like Grand Dragon and Imperial Wizard, said that the Klan is intolerant of people who are trying to destroy our traditional Americanism, that nativist mentality, that the Klan didn't like aliens, not like space aliens, but people from not America, who are constantly trying to change our civilization into something that will benefit themselves. In the early 1920s, the Klan goes from not existing in 1914 to having 3 to 4 million members and targeting African Americans, immigrants, Jewish Americans, and Catholics as they worked to keep America white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. 30,000 members of the KKK end up publicly marching, which is the photo that we have as the backdrop for this slide, on Washington, D.C. in 1925 in a show of united force and promoting nativist ideas. In response to this open demonstration of racist bigotry, we see unions of people actively trying to fight it, like the American Civil Liberties Union or the ACLU, who form in the 1920s to protect freedom of speech and protect unpopular people and individuals who are being targeted by newspapers and media that were painting people as villains. We also see a huge wave of Jewish immigration in the US in the 1920s as Eastern Europe falls into the Russian Civil War and anti-Semitism is on the rise in Europe. Many Jewish people flee to the US to find a safe place, and what they find here is more anti-Semitism, or this belief that somehow Jewish people are at fault. And in response to that hatred, we see the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, established, and their goal is to secure justice and fair treatment to all citizens and battled against discrimination against Jewish Americans. So basically, what we see in the 20s is this tension rise between people promoting nativist and racist ideas and groups of people coming together to fight those nativist and racist ideas, although not in the same numbers, right? We have 3 to 4 million members of the KKK, and these tensions keep building until they break out in violence across the country. And one of the ideal examples of that outbreak of violence is in the summer of 1919, we have actual race riots erupt in Chicago. And this is not necessarily religious-fueled tension, but is most definitely race-based. So African Americans fought in World War I, and the veterans who experienced a new level of equality within the military, especially in combat, although it's not like the battalions were integrated. They still had black battalions and white battalions in World War I. But French and British soldiers didn't care if an American soldier was black or white. They were just happy to have the help. And so African American soldiers come home from the war expecting or hoping for a new level of equality. And instead they find an America that has little to offer them as far as employment and increased racial tension. In 1919, there are more than 70 African Americans who are murdered by lynch mobs, and as governments do little to stop that kind of racially fueled violence. Chicago becomes a center for the riots over a swimmer. In Lake Michigan, there's a whites-only section and a colored people section where people can swim, and a member accidentally swam. An African American swam into the whites only. Every account uses the word drifted, so there's this really clear verb there. Accidentally ends up in the whites only portion of Lake Michigan, and an angry mob ends up killing him over that crossing of the boundary. And when people find out that he's been killed for swimming in the area he wasn't supposed to, we see violence break out in Chicago, and ultimately 500 people are injured and 38 people killed as 4 days of riots turned Chicago into a small war zone. We have images here showing families. This is like an angry mob that is posing in front of a house that they've just set on fire. You can see they've broken a window and taken the time to pose for a photograph. And then we have an American veteran facing off against a member of the National Guard, as the National Guard is called in to bring peace to Chicago, usually with threats of violence. And we have a newspaper headline talking about how gun battles and fighting in the streets keep the city in uproar. 4,000 troops in armor ready to patrol the city as tens of people are killed. It's pretty ugly, and not the only race riot to erupt in the summer of 1919, but probably the largest and one of the most notable. Claude McKay is a poet who writes about his experience with the Chicago riots, saying that if we must die, let it not be like hogs. And this poem does a good job of, I think, expressing the frustration that a lot of Americans felt as they watched people attack them. Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. All of the rising tensions of the 1920s are only going to get worse as the economy starts to crumble in the later half of the decade. So we're going to go ahead and pause here, and we'll be back in the next video.